Welcome back to Principles of Incident Response and Disaster Recovery. Hope you had a great Thanksgiving and are ready to finish up this class in the next few weeks. This week we'll be talking about Chapter 10, Operation and Maintenance. Because the plans and procedures used for disaster recovery are very similar to those undertaken for incident response and business continuity actions, material in this chapter will seem similar to the material in other chapters. They're building on each other. An organization can interchangeably use many of the approaches discussed with respect to business resumption planning, the incident response, disaster recovery, business continuity planning. Whereas Chapter 9 discussed the planning aspects of disaster recovery, this chapter examines the operational aspects, specifically implementing the plan in preparation, response, or reaction, and then the actual recovery that you're going to perform. Okay. In this chapter, this will describe the key challenges an organization faces when engaged in the disaster recovery operations. We'll discuss what actions the organization should take. We're going to list the critical elements that comprise the response phase of the disaster recovery plan. We'll look at the recovery phase of the disaster recovery plan, and then we'll look at the organization and how it uses the resumption phase of the disaster recovery plan. And then finally we'll look at how the organization gets back into the normal operations and gets back to their daily preparation for the next disaster. As sad as that may sound, but it is exactly what happens. We have to continue to be diligent and be ready to go for what might happen. All right, looking at our introduction, an organization should operate on the premise that it is only a matter of time until a disaster strikes. Note that only through meticulous preparation and ongoing diligence can it properly respond when a disaster actually occurs. So we have to be mindful and ready at any time. It's kind of like the police. While they try to keep everything civil, there are situations that make them have to jump to action, and it's not always a good situation. And just firemen, same way. Usually when a fireman's called, yes, they do have other issues that they might resolve, monitor homes, businesses, making sure that they have smoke detectors, stuff like that. But the majority of their calls is when a disaster is happening, when there's a fire and they have to jump into action to either try to save a life, save a residence or a business, or try to minimize the damage to other locations or other buildings. Okay, some key challenges that we need to look at. Part of the challenge with disaster planning is that the disasters are not confined to the IT department, nor are they limited to the assets of an organization. Frequently, when a disaster occurs, it is widespread enough to affect departments and various levels of authority in an organization. It affects the community that it encompasses the organization, and perhaps affects vendors and suppliers. Note that a seemingly routine event can quickly spin out of control, creating a worst-case scenario, and we have to be prepared for that. We will briefly discuss the 5 phases involved in the implementation of the disaster recovery plan. Okay, the steps are shown: preparation, response, recovery, resumption, and then restoring back to the day-to-day operations. All right. Preparation mainly is dealing with the training of the disaster recovery team and the users that you might pull in to help minimize the downtime. Note that in the planning there is no prevention phase, unlike incident response planning. This is because the vast majority of disasters cannot be prevented. When things happen, it's because It could be an act of God, it could be an act of terrorism, it could be a wide variety of things. Okay, but it's stuff that we weren't planning for. We can't determine exactly what's going to happen. We just know that we should be ready to respond to worst case scenarios if that happens. Preparation is the only strategy that an organization can use to hopefully mitigate the effects of a disaster. On the plan distribution, once the plan has been fully developed, it is critical to get copies into the hands of those who will need it the most. Note that how the plan is distributed is not as important as making sure that all personnel have access to the plan, have fully read it, and understood it. You can't just give them a piece of paper and anticipate that they'll read it at some time or understand it. You do not want someone to be looking at the documentation while the disaster is as preparation, or I should say while you're dealing with the disaster itself. That's not the time to be trying to understand what the plan is doing. They should already know. If there's some changes that need to be made, they should have already made those comments at that time while you're preparing it, I should say. In order to cover all the bases, password protected copies of critical contingency plans should be stored at the office, should be stored away from the office, online, and anytime, anywhere. Because it does have some very delicate information in it, and we do not want our competitors, we don't want enemies, we don't want anybody that wishes to do us harm to have that information, because then they could actually do something with that that could cause more problems. Okay, planning for triggers and notification. We need to discuss the different phases. Management notification. The upper management needs to be notified there's an incident we're responding to. We need to understand that we're going to be pulling out all the stops just like our plan has told us that we're going to. Employee notification. The employees, pretty much everyone needs to be notified. We need to have some people on site to help with the disaster recovery, but we also need to make sure that the employees don't come to work, that they understand that they need to just stay away until the situation is resolved. Emergency management notification. If it's a fire, if it's a tornado or a hurricane, most of them will know it already, but they may not know that your location has been damaged. If it's just dealing with IT or power or something like that, there probably isn't the need to notify the emergency management, except for those that are employed by the company. You'll not want to call the police or fire because they'll probably be dealing with enough problems as it is. Only engage them if there is a situation that needs their expertise. And then media outlets. If it's a business, we want to make sure people aren't coming there anticipating. If it's let's say it's a laundry where you drop your laundry off, we want to make sure people aren't coming to try to get their clothes if there's a disaster. Let's say it's a store, electronic store or food store. People may need to come and thinking that they wanted to purchase something. Okay, well they need to stay away because it's not a place for spectators or people that are unaware of what's going on. Back to looking at the preparation. It's the cornerstone. You need to develop that disaster recovery plan. That is the primary goal. It may never be needed, and great if it is, but if in fact you do have a disaster and you do not have a plan, it will catastrophically make the situation much worse. Okay? You could, instead of just losing just a little bit of resources, or I mean there's just a wide variety of things that could happen, but if you do not have a good plan, you can make it much worse, because maybe you're only going to lose some of your data. Okay, without a disaster recovery plan, maybe you'll lose it all. So it's very important to plan for that, because you never know until you do the planning what kind of impact you could see from an incident. You need to note that the plan must be tested regularly so that the team can lead the recovery effort quickly and efficiently and get back to the day-to-day work that we want to perform. So making sure that we generate the disaster recovery scenario, start with the most important asset, which is the people. We need to keep our people safe. Okay? And then, like we said, we must test it regularly. The key features of the disaster recovery plan: clear delegation of roles and responsibilities. We need to make sure that management is on board. If, let's say, that a specific manager was going to be responsible, then that person needs to be determined up front. Okay, if a disaster happens, Billy Bob is the person that's responsible. They will direct all activities. Okay, if Billy's not available, then Susie Smith is. Okay, we need to have that list of who's responsible and what roles they have. A leader is the key thing. They'll have the best understanding of the plan. They'll be able to delegate, different activities to different people. Execution of the alert roster and notification. A lot of times companies have this automated. You could use a third-party company to be able to send that notification out if there was a problem at the site. And then also, we want to make sure if it's a tornado or a hurricane or some other act of God, terrorism, whatever, we want to make sure our people are safe. Okay. Once again, going back to the previous slide, the people are the most important thing. Okay, so we want them to check in. Okay, while the site may be down, we still want to make sure that the people are safe. We want them to check in because there may be a need to go help somebody at their home. Maybe they were in an apartment complex that got damaged, and they may need help getting their goods out of the location. Okay, all those kind of things come into play when you think of your company. It's not just about keeping the doors open. It's about keeping the people safe and responding to their needs also. So having the employee check in, making sure that everything's okay. Clear establishment and communication of business resumption priorities. What's the most important thing? Going back to if it's a cleaners, laundry, we want to make sure that people get their clothes back. Okay, that's a little basic. If it's a grocery store in a small town, well, we want to make sure that we're able to help people get their food as quick as possible. Maybe they don't have another location they can go to. Maybe it's 30, 50 miles away. We want to make sure that we keep that in mind. While the grocery store may have had a fire, it impacts a lot of people, and we want to show how we can respond quickly to their needs also. Complete and timely documentation of what's going on. Preparations for alternative implementations. And a lot of times other companies will help out. Even your competitors will help. I remember hearing about a company that was an architect company that was had a fire or something, and their competitor allowed them to use some of their space, the drafting tables and all that, at their location. Okay, that's just goodwill. If you can help another company in a disaster situation, that karma will come back, I would hope. If not, it still is the right thing to do. And then the direct disaster recovery team members should know their disaster duties. We need to make sure that they understand what their roles are. Some final ones during this disaster response: verify status of employees, contractors, consultants. That disaster recovery plan should have that all documented. Who will we use for water issues? Who will we use for construction if we need to if your site was damaged by a tornado? Okay, how do we get the windows back in so we can make the place safe? Who does the cleanup? There's a lot of things. But first, First priority is preservation of life, making sure that the people are safe. Carefully record disaster from the onset. We need to know what happened, what responses, because we'll build on that, making sure that the next time it goes better. Each time should be better and better. Hopefully, if you do have to deal with a disaster, it's a small one to test out the plan first. Hopefully, you don't have a situation where it just destroys a building, and then you have to, wonder if your plan is going to be sufficient or not. Mitigation of impact, action steps to minimize damage associated with the disaster on operations. Okay, if you're not able to do any kind of computing because your data center's down, okay, you should understand that from the very beginning. If your building is damaged and you do not have anywhere else to perform that work, then you need to know that it's going to be down until it's restored. Okay, whether it be an hour, a day, a week, a month, it can be a wide variety of time frames. And if you want to mitigate that, then you need to do something ahead of time to prepare for it. Some additional preparations. 2 types of emergency information employees need: personal emergency information. If they're having to go live somewhere else, where is that? If it's out of the city and they need to come into work, well, it's going to impact them. Where somebody may be 5 minutes away, now they're having to be an hour and a half away. And if the town or city is damaged, it may take longer than that, or maybe they won't even be able to get into the city. If I think about the tornado down in Houston, I mean, that impacted a lot of people, and they could not travel very easily. And the other thing we need is the snapshot of the disaster recovery plan, once again stored in multiple locations so that we have it available if the building that you store your information on is destroyed. Emergency information often encapsulated into a wallet-sized laminated card where we can have it with us at all times. Crisis management focused steps dealing primarily with the safety and state of the people involved in the disaster, and the team works closely with the crisis management team on how we're going to keep everybody safe and get our business back in operation as quickly as possible. The training and awareness involves different approaches. It should focus on roles individually expected to execute during an actual disaster. And training all the people who have an interest in the disaster planning process involves a number of different approaches. The awareness training, part of an annual or semi-annual security education, training and awareness, or SETA program. Make employees aware of general procedures for responding to disasters so they have an understanding. We don't want just our little core team to be the ones that understand all the different ramifications. We might need to have others pulled in, so we want to have them trained also. General training for all teams. Best crisis preparation. Ensure that the employees trained and comfortable in completing the normal task. What are they going to be able to do? Training and rehearsals should identify those individuals with less than ideal technical skills and provide them with the opportunity to brush up on their responsibilities. We need to note that not all systems may be recovered during the disaster, with the priorities established during the getting business back in operation. And then we need to know that we could be in a degraded mode. Okay, so you may not be able to get 100%. Okay, what's it going to take to get 25% out? 50, 75. Work with those different numbers so that you understand how we're going to be able to get back to those levels as quick as possible. The team training, command and control, responsible for all planning and coordination activities. It needs to be someone that has an understanding of command and control. Okay. An ex-military person is ideal, police or fire, someone that has been trained in monitoring or making sure that they can lead that kind of situation. You don't want a timid person that could easily get walked on. Okay? It needs to be a strong person that can go in and say, I need you to do this, I need you to stay on top of this until it's done. and then move to the next person. All those different pieces. Okay, the training, rehearsal, and testing, predominantly communicative in nature. It's that understanding of, hey, this is what we're going to do, this is how, and then how you're going to communicate that to the group. Okay. You must communicate directives from higher teams. It goes back to having the right people in the right place. Communications, their responsibility is for interacting and communicating with the external environment, whether it be fire and police, the media. All those different aspects need to have that communication, because there'll always be someone that wants to get involved that may not be part of the team and may not have a place for them. So we want to make sure that we have an understanding and know the training aspect of it. Okay. It prepares the training, rehearsal, and testing, prepares the information, notices, news releases, and internal memorandums and directives. Have an understanding of how we present that information. Okay, sends communications to all groups and teams, and it informs people of their tasks and responsibilities. Should be involved in routine rehearsal and testing. We can't stress that enough, that we have to have the capability to support this at the drop of a hat. So the only way we're going to be able to do that is have a clear understanding of who is supposed to do what, and then make sure we test and train for that. Okay. On the hardware team for computer recovery, our recovery and reconstitution team, they're the ones that actually work with the vendors if something's been destroyed, to make sure we get something back on play in-house, at our offsite, wherever we need to be able to stand up equipment. Ideally practices and trains during normal operation. On the training requirements, advanced training to rebuild systems by scavenging parts. Knowledge in how to deal with systems damaged by water, heat, and dust. Teams should work closely with other technology teams to understand the ramifications and how we're going to be able to get back up and running. Okay, here's an example of a computer repair bench. Granted, it's probably a little bit dated because pretty much we're not going to do component level repairs. We're going to swap out motherboards, disks, whatever it takes to get the equipment back up and running. Okay, on this recovery team training, responsible for recovering is reestablishing operating systems. Okay, we got the hardware back up. Now we need to make sure that the systems have the operating systems to be able to support. May rehearse disaster recovery duties during normal operations, and this happens, without being a disaster. Someone could lose a hard disk. Okay, well, it's some of the same principles. Okay, we need to get repair the hardware and then get the machine back up and running as quick as possible. So we should have already been doing this in our day-to-day operation. But still, they need to train to quickly recover systems, operating systems. It's a big difference fixing 1 or 2 computers and 100 to 200 to 1,000 computers. So we've got to be able to know, what steps we can take. On the network side, responsible for reestablishing connectivity between systems and to the internet. This gets a little bit more touchy because it's going back to our Houston example. Okay, well, maybe our site wasn't damaged, but the location that our network is based out of, maybe it was. Okay? Maybe it was AT&T, maybe it was Cox, maybe it was Verizon. Whoever you use for your connectivity, their location, their central office, where your connectivity goes, may have been impacted. So we have to understand, and a lot of times we'll have 2 divergent paths going to 2 different locations so that we can make sure we have that redundancy in place, so we're not going to be impacted if one location is out. But going back to the training side, establishing ad hoc networks quickly but securely. We want to make sure our data is not being compromised just because we had a disaster. That was going back to earlier, that we could make things much worse by thinking that we're getting something up and running quickly and we're just bypassing security. There's no rationale for that. We can't be losing that much money to risk losing all of our data. The wireless technology, while it's good, we need to make sure that we're secure. Once again, we don't want people to be able to compromise our data because we moved into a large building with many other vendors, and then the data is not secure. And the team requirements: stash of wireless networking components stored outside the organization, making sure that we have that capability in multiple locations. That's why it's really nice to have multiple locations that could host some of this equipment, and then send it to one of the other locations if there's a problem. And then the internet connectivity, like we were saying, it's going to be a problem if the vendor is down. Okay, because they could be going through the same thing, doing the same disaster recovery plans. Maybe they're more concerned about their people and not about our connectivity. Okay, well, that will impact us. Okay, on the storage side, responsible for information recovery and establishment of the operations. In storage area networks or network attached, large storage. We need to make sure we have the right power, connectivity. It doesn't just come up quickly if there's a problem. So we need to make sure we understand and have the people that know how to build those systems back up and get them up and running. You might need to be calling EMC or NetApp, depending on who your storage is bought through. And then making sure that we have the ability, if you have the offsite, be able to recover the data. Maybe need to get tapes and restore it to systems if you don't have offsite online redundancy or replication to a remote site. Okay. Example of a hard disk could be damaged. The key thing on this is making sure that if the hard drive is bad, that we destroy it. It might need to get the platters destroyed, take this apart, drill holes through the platters. The platters are the round plates that are seen here, usually going to be multiple. They're stacked on top of each other like pancakes, and with the head, which is that silver piece. Let's go right over here. This is the head. This moves across to read data across these platters, and there could be 2, 10. In the old days there was quite a few, and it didn't store very much data, but they've gotten so small that we may not be able to get the drive back up and running. Underneath it is the printed circuit board. Maybe that was damaged, maybe it got wet, but the data could still possibly be recovered off this. So if you have backups, that's fine, but you want to make sure that this drive doesn't fall into someone's hand that could pull the data off. Okay, so make sure it's destroyed. Solid state drives are another issue. They don't have spinning disk. There's no way to clean them up and be able to reuse them if they're damaged. So we may have to destroy them also. Whoop, a little farther here. Okay, on the applications recovery training aspect, this is the team responsible for recovering and reestablishing the operations of critical business applications. Could be an Oracle database, could be a website, a wide variety of things. Once again, some of the requirements: skills performed during normal operations. We should already, once again, have the capability to support those this downtime because we've already been doing that type of operations. Coordination and training and operating under adverse circumstances. The power could have been out, months earlier, and maybe you had an understanding of what you needed to do, and now you've had a disaster where it's going to be off for weeks. So you should have an understanding of how to operate in that different capabilities. Team will have user representation so that they can test and make sure it does look and gives the capability to the end user or the customer. Team effectiveness, heavily influenced by ability to create an effective liaison with application business units. So they may not be part of the core disaster recovery team, but they still need to be able to tell what, if everything's working like it should. Okay, on the team training for data management, responsible for data restoration and recovery. This is the team primarily responsible for restoration and recovery of the data. Its training correspondingly focuses on quick and accurate restoration of data from backups. And if we look at another example, so you can see this damaged optical drive, kind of like a CD, may have gotten, destroyed. Once again, we need to see if we can get the data off. If we can't, make sure it gets, destroyed so it can't be any data be recovered off of it. All right. On the vendor side of the house, this team is responsible for working with suppliers and vendors to replace damaged or destroyed equipment or services as determined by the other teams. Other people will feed to us. The hardware team will tell us, hey, I need 50 computers. The server team may say, I need to have a new 2 or 3 servers. The network team might say, I have a router or a switch that's been damaged. Okay, I need to be able to get that as quickly as possible. And that's why it's really important to have this worked out so that we have an understanding of how we can get the information as quickly, I should say, the equipment as quickly as possible. And we should have once again be doing this, in our day-to-day operations. Okay, the vendor relationships is crucial during a disaster. Okay? You can't just say, hey, HP, I need to have 50 computers here tomorrow or in the next hour. Put them on a plane. If you do not have that relationship up front, then you can't pull out that kind of scenario, when the disaster is happening, because they may be working with other people also. So you need to make sure you have that in place ahead of time. Okay, the assessment and salvage. We need to have initial damage to equipment and systems on site. We need to have that assessment, I should say, for that. Physically recovering equipment transported to a location where other teams evaluate it. If you don't have power, it's hard to tell if the computer has a problem or not. If you don't have lights, it's very difficult to understand what's going on with the equipment. So we may need to pick it up, make sure we label it so we know, this machine was Billy's and this other machine was Sue's, because there may be data on it that they need to have access to. And we need to have that basic understanding of hardware repair, and then we may need to outsource the function to other people. You may need to get Dell for workstations if that's what you're using, or HP or IBM. You may need to use them, or you may need to use a third party to be able to get that equipment back up and running as quickly as possible. Okay, the business interface team. This team is responsible for working with the remainder of the organization to assist in the recovery of non-technology functions. And there may be other aspects that we need to be working on. It combines the technical and non-technical functions, involves interfacing with various business groups to determine routine needs, how we're going to support them. And the help desk representatives will be well suited for this team because they know how to respond to situations where maybe someone hasn't taken their computer home and access through a secure tunnel or a VPN. Okay, they'll have a better understanding of how to get them online and ready to go. The logistics team. This team is responsible for providing any needed supplies, space, materials, food, services, or facilities needed at the primary site, other than vendor-acquired technology and other material obtained by the vendor team. Okay, they serve as health, welfare, and morale, which is really important. If people are stressed, they've been working a lot of hours, and they're trying to get things. It's maybe dirty. If it was a fire, cleaning up after a fire is a very messy job. Okay, You want to make sure that the morale is kept up. And one of the best ways, I'm sorry, is food and drink, making sure that the people have cold water, they have something to eat, all those types of things. Okay, testing and rehearsal. Once again, note that in practice, the testing of disaster recovery plan elements can overlap with the training and rehearsal of the plan. In the strictest sense, an organization rehearses when it practices the steps to be performed during a disaster, and testing, on the other hand, involves assessment, whether internal or external. Should be aware that many organizations never test and rehearse beyond the desk check or structured walkthrough, which are shown right here. And although some rehearsal is better than none, the farther along the scale of rehearsal and testing the organization can progress, the better off it will be when an actual disaster occurs. Okay, so being able to go through all these steps is very important. Wargaming, just making sure that we've tested the different capabilities. Once again, making sure that we have the information of where our employees are. The alert roster is used in the incident response and business continuity planning and crisis management. Are all of our people safe? It's very important. The alert roster must be tested more frequently than other components of the plans because it is subject to continual change because of employee turnover. People change phone numbers, we can't get a hold of them. Note that in the military, as well as in many corporate settings, alert rosters are tested at least quarterly. It's not something that's a big deal. Just send out a test message, you respond, and we go on. Nothing more difficult than that. And then we need to understand that there's two different activation methods, sequential and hierarchical, and that we need to make sure that we have the next one on the alert message, that we have the scripted disaster description, and we understand what's going on. We want to make sure that the employees do not come to work, except for those that are on the disaster recovery team. Consists of just enough information so that each responder knows what portion of the DR plan to implement for those that are involved. For the other ones, like I said, please stay mindful, but do not come into work. And it does not impede the notification process. The auxiliary phone alert and reporting system, information system with telephony interface. Like I said, most of the time we're going to go with a third party. We don't want it in-house because if our building's damaged, then we do not do any kind of messaging. So the best thing is to use a remote entity for that will have different capabilities to make sure that they're up all the time. I'm okay, automated emergency response line. Employees call a predetermined number and let management know that they're fine. The disaster recovery phase, the response associated with implementing initial reaction to disaster, and the focus is controlling or stabilizing the situation if possible. Okay, if it's a fire, making sure that the fire's out. If the power's out, how do we get it restored? And there could be plenty of other things after any one of those, but the basic understanding is it's a step approach. We're going to do one thing and the next and the next. Some things can be done in parallel, but needless to say, you're not going to clean up a fire if the fire's still going. Okay, we want to make sure it's out first. The response phase is designed to protect human life and well-being, physical safety, attempt to limit and contain the damage to the organization's facilities and the equipment, and then manage communications with employees and stakeholders, especially leadership. They want to be kept mindful of what's going on, especially those if your headquarters is in another city, they're going to want to know that everyone's safe. Recovery of the most time-critical functions, like we said, we want to make sure those are up and running as quickly as possible, even if the operation is limited to some degree, like we said, the 50, 75%. Okay, we want some, if we can get something in place, then that's good. Less critical operations wait till resumption phase. We're not in a big hurry if it's not that important. We're not that concerned about the employee break room if the building is not open. Okay? So the key pieces are important first. Primary goals: recover critical business functions, coordinate recovery efforts, acquire resources to replace damaged or destroyed materials, and then evaluate the need to implement the business continuity plan that we've discussed before. The resumption phase: BIA guiding document for creating our list of primary and secondary functions and the goals of this phase. Initiate implementation of secondary functions, other locations if we need to. Finalize implementation of primary functions, identify the additional needed resources, continue planning for restoration. Like we said, we may be a stair-step approach. Maybe we're just going for 25% the next day, 50% the next couple of days, and then some percentage up to 100 over the course of the following weeks. Complex interaction exists between the disaster recovery plan and business continuity. Like we said, we may not be able to get 100% good to go on the disaster recovery, but maybe we can get a piece for the business continuity side. On the restoration phase, be aware that this phase may represent the end of a business too damaged by the disaster to recover, as even the best laid schemes of mice and men go oft awry. Okay, so note that organizations do not like to think of this as a possibility, but if it costs more than it's worth, then it's, going back to Houston, there's a lot of businesses that are probably going to have to shut down, especially if the insurance doesn't cover it, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if they're not able to recover, they may not have the money to get back up in operation. Okay. Two possibilities in the restoration phase: reestablish operations at the primary site or establish operations at a new permanent site. Going back to Houston again, some of those buildings may need to be destroyed, or it may be months until they're back in operation because of the damage, especially those with basements that had maybe all their electrical down there. Okay, well, having to pump all the water out and then replace everything, get rid of the mold that may be in the walls. There's just a lot of things that go along with getting back up and running. Okay. Move to a new site. Occurs if the primary site's uninhabitable. Bulldoze and rebuild. Oh, such a tough thought. Okay. If you own the land, okay, tear it down and start over. But it's going to, if it's any size building, it may be quite a while. Okay. That's why it may be better to select a new location for temporary capabilities. 3 months, 6 months, a year. It may be necessary when an organization cannot relocate for an extended stay at temporary locations. Selection of a new permanent site. Complex decision. Once again, down in Houston, there may not be any other sites available in the city. Maybe if you go 50, 100 miles from your other office, that may be too big of an impact. Okay? You might need to, relocate families. Or you may not be able to. You may have to hire new. Restoration of the primary site occurs once the facilities are rebuilt. Must replace office furniture, desktops, copying all the electronics that we have that we take for granted. Okay. Cabinets to hold files. Determine what insurance will and will not cover. Okay. Having that information up front is probably pretty important. If you don't understand what your insurance company will support, and you go to, after the disaster, try to figure that out, and you know that they're going to pay $1,000 and it's costing you $100,000, it's going to be a problem. Examine the service contracts that you might have in place. Determine if damage or destruction to leased equipment is covered by the provider. If not, you may be out that money. All of a sudden now you're getting a bill from Dell that says, okay, you leased these and that wasn't covered under the contract, so you're going to have to pay us for the 100 machines that were destroyed. Oh, and by the way, you're going to have to pay for the other 100 that you got to replace them with. Okay. Movement back to the primary site signals beginning of the end of the disaster operations. We're finally getting closer to that 100% mark. It could have been a year. Must be carefully coordinated, and it's not very simple. Must relocate people and administrative paperwork, and must restore data functions and associated computing equipment. There are difficulties when you start to think about the coordination of the move back to the site after using an alternate location. Data management practices are even more crucial before and after the moves. Note that in some cases it may be advantageous to have a movement coordinator to plan and coordinate the relocation of personnel, equipment, materials, and data from the alternate back to the primary site. The resumption of the primary site, once again, getting closer, and even closer to that 100%. Okay. Point out that the need to know to bring all business functions back online, including the non-critical functions that may have been suspended. So all the different pieces that we have listed here, we may be looking at again. Management of employee benefit packages, employee training and awareness, organization planning, routine progress, meetings and reports, the long-term plan, once again moving from that 0% to 100%. Could be months, could be years. It's not something that can be done overnight for many of these disasters. All right. Standing down, deactivation of disaster recovery teams. Releasing the individuals back to their normal duties, and if it's been months, it could be a very stressful time. So make sure you acknowledge that. The action item after action review, which is the last activity before declaring disaster officially over. Management obtains input and feedback from the teams. We want to understand what went right, what went wrong, and how we can make it better for the next time. Lessons learned, best practices, all those types of things are going to help us have a better understanding. Okay. On the official log, the legal and planning record and training tool, we may have to document different legal aspects. Make sure that it's all documented, because if the insurance company says, okay, where's your documentation that shows what loss you really had? If you can't come up with that, then they may not be paying all those extra costs that you incurred. And the last steps, creation and archiving of the official report. As we said, it may be important for the legal aspect. Once archived, the disaster is over, and I'm sorry to say you're preparing for the next one, which is a sad case of affairs, but it is the truth. Okay, in summary, matter of time until a disaster strikes. So we just had one, so we're preparing for the next one. Meticulous preparation and ongoing diligence needed to properly respond. Like we said, if we've just experienced one, then we should be using the lessons learned, best practices to have an understanding of what we did good and what we did bad. On the plan, involves 5 phases: preparation, that we should be doing day in and day out, the response, recovery, resumption, and then restoration. And like we said, this could be a week, it could be years, depending on what the disaster is. The resumption planning goals: eliminate or reduce potential injuries or loss of human life, facility damage, loss of assets and records. Stabilize the effects of the disaster, and then implement the disaster recovery and business resumption procedures. On the recovery phase, quick critical business function recovery is at first 50%. or less, depending on what kind of business you operate. Resumption focuses on remaining unrestored functions to get us to 100%. And then the restoration phase, the primary goals is to repair the damage or select or build a new facility. Having that understanding up front is really important. Replace primary site damaged or destroyed and the contents that were in there. Coordinate relocation from temporary to primary site or to the new replacement facility. Restore the normal operations at the primary site. We're ready to go. Have a celebration. Make sure that you acknowledge the people that spent all those extra hours getting everything back up and running. Stand down the team and conduct the action after results, and then have an understanding of what the next steps are. A lot of stuff to go through. You have to be prepared. That is the key piece, making sure that you understand that it could happen and how to respond to it. Thanks for your attention, and have a good week.